to the EU's global approach to migration and mobility and any related matters. And as you and I discussed outside, you've expressed a willingness to say a bit about the subject of our next inquiry, which is Protocol 36 of the Lisbon Treaty, and we'll take anything you have to say on that at the end of the question. So it would be very valuable to us to have your views on that point, because it will be part of the evidence base for our own inquiry, which will start round about the end of the year and is due to be completed in very good time to enable it to feed into the parliamentary process that has to take place on Protocol 36, following the Home Secretary's confirmation that there will be votes in both houses on that subject in due course. So going back to migration and mobility, as you know, the session is open to the public. A webcast of the session goes out live as an audio transmission and is subsequently accessible via the parliamentary website, and I also understand that it will feature on BBC Parliament, perhaps helped by the fact that the other House place is not sitting at the moment. It may actually get one or two viewers, who knows. A verbatim transcript will be taken of your evidence, and this will be put on the parliamentary website. A few days after this evidence session, you will be sent a copy of the transcript to check it for accuracy, and we'd be grateful if you could advise us of any corrections as quickly as possible. If after this session you wish to clarify or amplify any points made during your evidence or have any additional points to make, you are welcome to submit supplementary evidence to us. Now, perhaps if you could just briefly introduce yourself, and if you wanted to make some opening remarks, that would be entirely acceptable to the committee. But if, on the other hand, you wanted to move straight to questions, that would be equally acceptable.
Well, Lord Hannay, firstly to introduce myself, my name is Charles Clark. Between 1997 and 2010, I was Member of Parliament for Norwich South, and I served as a Minister in the Home Office for policing in 1999 to 2001, and then Home Secretary from 2004 to 2006. As a result of those periods of service, I've taken a great interest in these matters and a great interest in the matter of migration as a whole, which is obviously a very hot political question. I'm delighted you've asked me to give evidence. Thank you very much for doing so. I greatly appreciate it. I don't think I have a great deal to say in terms of an initial statement, except to remark that I think almost all opinion formers in the UK tend to see immigration and migration strictly in the UK context. I think the right way to look at it is in the European Union context as a whole, which is why I wrote the pamphlet which I have circulated beforehand. But I think to get that kind of way of thinking established requires a real sea change. When I was Home Secretary, I addressed in my capacity as President of the Council of the European Union, the European Parliament at Strasbourg, and I said the era when Britain could rely upon the White Cliffs of Dover as repelling all aliens are a long time past, and we need to accept that we're part of the European Union, albeit not in Schengen, and that we need to look at policies which take that into account, and that's how I think the migration policy should be addressed.
Yes, well, this committee, in an earlier report that we did on the internal security strategy of the European Union, which of course includes a whole range of issues much wider than illegal migration, did observe that Britain's national security neither begins nor ends at the water's edge, which is, I think, I hope reasonably succinctly expresses the view you've just stated. But just if I could ask you one question on that, the quite interesting figures that came out in the last 2 days on the census, British demography, the level of migration into Britain, which does seem to be of a rather different order of magnitude to that in a number of other European countries. Does that sort of affect the judgment that you described just now, and if so, in what way?
I wouldn't say the figures do affect my judgment that I've given. Obviously, we've only seen the first stage of the census, though, as you say, the first figures produced earlier this week are extremely interesting. But my bottom line on this is that the numbers way of looking at this is not a correct way of looking at the migration question. The idea that there's simply an appropriate size for the population of the UK, which lasts forever, I don't think is right. I think a much more profound question is to what extent can every citizen or every person who lives in the UK, sorry, not every citizen, every person who lives in the UK, able to fulfil themselves and play a positive role in the economy and society of this country. And I think that's the core question rather than the number of people who are physically in this country at any given time. There are obviously other countries in the EU which have a far higher density of population than we do. And I don't believe myself there is some arbitrary level that you can say, well, that's it. The concern that I think is very deep amongst the British people is about the sense of anarchy, of not knowing who is coming into the country, not knowing who's entitled to be there, not being certain who is really here and on what basis. And so I say that the issue is to address the governance of migration and to ensure that it's clear and transparent and well operated, which it has not been. And that is the way to deal with the concerns that people have, rather than taking any number and saying there's a kind of number and then we're full up.
Lord Richard, I think this is precisely the question that you were going to ask as a supplementary to question 4. I wonder if you'd like to come in now and just follow that point up.
I was reading your pamphlet to the Centre of European Studies, and at the paragraph on page 4, the main inset, the inset is what is to be done. You then start the next paragraph by saying that the fact of migration is not itself the problem.
Yeah.
It's the illegality and the ineffective systems of governance and control that accompany it, which exist across much of Europe. That creates the real difficulties. Taking that, as so to speak, the text and what you were just saying, could you expand on that for us?
Yes. When I was Home Secretary, there were regular incidents of people who ought not to have been in this country doing things which people found appalling. A most extreme case, terrible murders of a police officer, but a wide range of other areas as well. And I thought that what outraged people was not that the people were in the country, but these were people who should not have been here. And it wasn't, if they'd been here properly and properly part of our procedures and processes, people would have accepted that. But what they felt, as I said earlier, was a quasi-anarchic sense that people were getting into the country without any basis of doing so, being smuggled into the country without any long-term commitment to the country, not putting anything back into the society, and that they felt that was destabilising to the way they saw the society. It wasn't an issue of race. I don't think the British people are massively racist right across the whole range, simply saying we don't want blacks here or whatever. Nor was it an issue of numbers, in my view. It was an issue, as I say, of a sense of lack of confidence that the government of the day, the society, had got the situation of migration under control. And that's why I focus in this pamphlet on the governance question, because I think that's the core instability that people have. And I do think there are serious issues about this. I mean, at the beginning of the Labour government, a lot of people came into the country as a result of our relaxation of the primary purpose rule, and we didn't employ enough people in our borders agency and so on to really manage the system. So you ended up having rooms this big, full of files of people who were here illegally, which hadn't been looked at for 3 or 4 years. It was absolutely terrible. And we had to address that, and it is in fact now addressed and I think resolved. But it was a massive, massive problem. But that sense that we were out of control, that we didn't know what we were doing, is what I think gives rise to the concern, rather than the simple sense that there are too many people here or something like that.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by governance. There's difficulty with that word, actually.
Former Prime Minister of your acquaintance, Harold Wilson, wrote a book called The Governance of Britain. And I
don't understand it then either.
I'm not sure he did either. What I meant, anyway, by the word governance, is firstly, are there clear rules? In this case, are there clear rules for who can come into the country and on what basis? Are they transparent so that everybody understands what they are? Are they, thirdly, implemented, i.e. operated in a way that people can have confidence if that is the rule will be applied? And I would say that combination of clarity of rules, of the transparency of those rules, and then enforcement of the rules is what I would call governance in this sense.
Good, thank you.
It has another sense, I'll call Lord Avery in a second, it has another sense in my understanding also, which is when one is talking about international rules, whether it's at the European level or the global level, where we're all quite clear that there is not a European government, nor a world government. Governance tends to be the word one uses for this set of rules that apply amongst a group of governments, but which are not in the hands of a single government. So I've always thought myself that that is another use of governance which is a legitimate one and which sort of sums up the things you're saying as well.
But I think it's very interesting that I agree with you, your description I agree with, but I think it begs a number of quite serious questions in this journey between governance in the way you've just described it and government. And indeed the EU itself is part of that journey from governance to government. And I think we are living in a world where there's a whole enormous range of laws which are established, UN conventions and so on, which govern our behaviour in a very significant way, but without taking it to the extent that we can actually govern, in the way that I used it in answer to Lord Richard, the issues in a clear way. And I think that gives rise to quite a lot of concerns. If you take the most obvious current example, the European Convention of Human Rights, there are many people who are very exercised about the application of that law or rule because they think it's not being applied in a way that takes account of the consequences of that decision. And that is a problem. So I think your description, Lord Hannay, is spot on. But the question it then generates is how do you move from governance to government? And in the European context, obviously that's an issue about the EU and its powers.
Lord Avery.
Coming from the theoretical to the practical, I expect you saw that the Chief Inspector of the UK Borders Agency found that 150,000 people who've been given short-term leave to enter the United Kingdom have been lost to the system. And I wonder if you think that Europe as a whole should have systems for monitoring the departure of people who come here for short-term reasons.
I do. I think the fundamental issue of enforcing visa regulations is very important. That's why we went towards the e-borders system. And there was a glitch in that process, but I believe that in a number of categories today, as far as the UK is concerned, the e-borders system is able to look at people leaving in the way that you describe, not yet universally, but in a number of categories. If you then ask, which you do, should that be extended across to the EU as a whole, I would definitely say yes. The whole basis of the argument that I make in this pamphlet is that the EU external border needs to be absolutely strong. And one meaning of the EU external border being strong is that you're able to know who's coming into the EU and who's leaving the EU, which requires some means of looking at it. The advantage, though it's controversial in many areas, of modern technology is that it's relatively easy to do that. For example, with a biometrically based identity card system of the kind, I could produce one out of my pocket, which was illegal until this government made them illegal, is a very easy means of checking people's movements in that way. And it's relatively easy to do. And I think, I suppose my core point is that people will not have confidence in the way in which migration is controlled and governed unless they believe that there are proper controls in these areas. And in my opinion, without that, we will not be able to make progress in any area.
Right. Well, I think we must get on with the questions. That's a very interesting start to our discussion. As Home Secretary, during the UK presidency in 2005, when the global approach that we're writing a report on now, although it's of course the second iteration we're writing the report on, was first proposed, could you explain what the government's objectives were at that time, and how well do you think they've been realised in the period since 2005 and the present time?
Yes, the origins of this were, in my own case, I became Home Secretary in December 2004. We were looking at a general election in May 2005. I felt it was absolutely critical to establish clarity as to what the UK government's approach was on migration. And so I immersed myself in that issue for the first month or so of my Home Secretaryship, and we produced our white paper in January 2005, which set out the basis of the point system and other approaches to try and deal with it. We went through the general election without immigration being a massively controversial issue, which is what I had feared. It didn't in fact take place. And so when we became president of the European Union on July the 1st, 2005, I immediately, after our general election, I felt it was important to push migration up the EU agenda for the reasons we've been alluding to earlier. So I suggested to my colleague immigration and home affairs ministers that we really should make it our affair to put migration right at the centre of the political agenda of the Home Affairs area. I thought that was more important than some of the things that the Justice and Home Affairs Council was looking at the time. I'd had specific sessions of it at the informal council that was held in Durham that year. And we got, for example, the UN Commissioner for Refugees to come to the council and discuss the issue. I believe that was the first time that at the EU level this issue had been addressed in the round, and eventually we got to a state of affairs where in the Hampton Court Declaration, which was the statement of the Council of Heads of Government and Heads of State and Heads of Government at the end of the year, migration was one of the key issues on the agenda, which was the first time that it had been so. Our ambition was to say that the EU was going to try and take steps to address the issues around migration, rather than simply saying it was nothing to do with them. And the position before that really was the JHA wasn't really dealing with it very much at all. There were some aspects of it, the Dublin Agreement and so on, but it wasn't really there. And so our idea was to push it up the agenda, and we thought the idea of a global approach was the right way to look at it. So you could look at the various issues in the round. And that's what we were trying to achieve. As far as where we've got to, I think that we have got a statement which is useful. I think it doesn't sufficiently prioritise and strategise, in my view. I saw the Home Secretary's evidence to this committee on this question. I agreed with quite a lot of what she said about the absence of priority and strategy in this. I think you need a much more bigger sense of priority and strategy. But I thought the statement that came out of this April's JHA Council, the EU Action on Migratory Pressure strategic statement under the Danish presidency, really took us a long way forward. When I went through that, it seemed like we really were moving towards a sense of trying to get hold of it. So I'd say at the time that you asked the question about 2005, it was simply an effort to get it up the agenda. Then gradually we were getting it up the agenda. We had institutions like Frontex being created, which were a consequence of that, and in my opinion a positive consequence of that. But it's taken a long time to get onto the more strategic approach. And I'd say the first time we've seen anything, as I say, I may have missed documents on it because I'm not actively engaged in this area so much now. But I thought the statement out of the Danish presidency from the Council last April was a real significant step forward in trying to get sharpness and focus. And that's what's needed, sharpness and focus.
Yes, that, of course, statement is one of the building blocks to, based on the Commission's document that we're looking at now.
Yes, indeed.
Did anybody want to follow that question up? Or shall no? Well, Lord Richard.
Really take it on, actually, to your view of the Commission's recent communication on global approach. I mean, do you think that those proposals will improve the effectiveness of the global approach? And what do you think are the main obstacles that are to be surmounted?
Well, if you take the 4 pillars which have been set out by the Commission, I think they're fine as pillars. I'd give them slightly different ordering, they call them, for equally important pillars. I don't think they are equally important. I think the second that they mention, the prevention and reduction of irregular migration and trafficking in human beings, is more important than any of the other 3, because it is the area which gives rise, in the context of the conversation we were having earlier, of the greatest doubts and uncertainties in the population about where we stand. Remember, many people in the population see the EU as the threat on this migration question rather than a potential solution in these areas. So I think that the idea of the pillars is good, but as I said a moment ago, I don't think it's sufficiently prioritised, and I think the prevention and reduction of irregular migration, their second pillar, needs to go right up the agenda. Their third pillar, I'd make the second most important aspect of those pillars, that is promoting international protection and enhancing the external dimension of asylum policy. And I think the other two, organising and facilitating legal migration and mobility and maximising the development impact of migration and mobility, I'd say both of those are lower priorities than the other two that I've mentioned. And I don't think there is yet that sense in the Commission's approach of a need to prioritise in particular ways, obviously because the issues I've mentioned are the most politically difficult.
Yes, I mean, it's the protectiveness side of the thing which you think should be at the top.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have to say the EU is helping, by proper governance, by proper regulation of migration, the member countries of the EU handle this issue in a positive way which respects human rights and so on, but deals with it in an effective way, and I don't think that's clear enough.
But unless you can deal with the protectiveness point, then you can't really get out the others.
Well, I don't think you get the confidence from the population to be able to do it, because they think, if you want to promote migration or organise and facilitate legal migration and mobility, using their phrase, if you're not keeping people if you're not keeping people out who ought to be out, then why should we have confidence in you? I think there's another intellectual problem in this. I started, when I was writing this pamphlet, thinking one could get to more harmonisation on migration and work, and things like the people who are migrating to work. And obviously the blue card system is an effort to try and achieve that. Actually, I don't think that's right. I think that you haven't got a single labour market in the European Union. You've got a wide variety of different labour markets. I myself am pretty unsympathetic to any migration into the EU in the medium term to do any work. I think we have enough people who live in the EU to do the work at the level we need in different areas. And I think we should be trying to really develop a proper labour market policy to ensure that the massive number of excluded people, unemployed people, are able over a period of time, obviously it's something you have to do over time, to contribute to the society more widely. And so that's where my focus would be. But I don't think that's really accepted in the EU leadership at the moment. I think they think that we are going to continue always to need, whether it's seasonal workers or high-quality IT workers or whatever it may be, from outside the EU. And I'm doubtful that that's true, say, 5 years from now.
Well, we had a lot of evidence from the Swedish Minister of Migration in this inquiry, who takes very much the contrary view and believes very strongly in a national policy of migration to work. Lord Judd.
You do, of course, deal a lot in your interesting pamphlet with the need for this to be tackled in the European context. You also refer to the importance of aid and foreign policy being part of the approach. Do you think we begin to do enough domestically and within Europe to forecast what is going to happen globally in terms of the pressures for migration?
Not at all. I mean, you have, Lord Judd, you have an extremely distinguished record in the whole of this field over the whole of your life, both in Parliament and outside. And you know about the subject better than I. But my own perception is that we need to have a much more integrated approach on a country-by-country basis, going through the aid policies, the trade policies, the investment policies, the migration policies, the foreign policy issues. And indeed, I achieved, when I was Home Secretary, a sheet that was produced, a 2-page sheet that was made available to all ministers who were having bilaterals with ministers in other countries, which went through all of these points as to what we were trying to achieve. And I believe that, generally speaking, these are all kept in separate silos and separate baskets, and people don't talk about them together in a coherent way. Part of the reason is the Home Office type issues are always rather unpleasant, because you're talking about keeping people out, or it's not as nice a subject to talk about as some of the other areas. But I think you have to deal with it in the round, and you have to say, we want a very strong and positive relationship with you in country X, and we want to do it in a way that recognises all the relationships between our countries.
That's very important, but it wasn't actually my question. My question was about predicting what future pressures are going to develop and being ready for them rather than reacting to them.
I completely agree, but the main pressures that come actually at the moment are as a result of events elsewhere. So the Arab Spring being an obvious recent example, or a conflict in some place, which provokes, quite understandably, massive movements of refugees and migrants. And that's what causes the issues. The reason I emphasise partnership in what I was saying is I think the stronger the partnership between the UK, but I would say the EU actually, and the countries we're talking about, the easier it is to predict exactly what you say and to see what's going to happen. And so we don't all say, oh gosh, it suddenly happened like this, because we've had a set of processes. I suppose I was responding a bit against your question in the sense that I'm not sure simply investing more resource in a group of academic researchers predicting what people movement is going to be will necessarily solve this problem. I think it's about practical partnerships. When I met the current chief executive of Frontex in Warsaw to talk about this, he was very, very, very clear that if you could develop a strong partnership, for example, between Spain and North Africa, or if there could have been a strong partnership between Greece and Turkey, for example, you may say impossible, then the people movements at the borders, which were massive, become much easier to deal with. In fact, there have been significant reductions where there have been strong partnerships. But the partnership should be positive on both sides, and that's where the aid comes in, and that's where the good trade relations, the agricultural produce and so on, all come into a different situation. But my belief is there is insufficient discussion of this, and therefore insufficient capacity, in answer to your question, to predict what the movement is going to be.
Did you ask for the floor, Lord Tomlinson?
Yes, just very briefly, Lord Chairman, because I was quite interested in what you were saying, that you were largely out of sympathy with continued large-scale immigration for employment purposes. But would you make some exceptions to that, where there clearly are national needs? I mean, for example, if you listen to the universities today, yes, we would have no teachers of any of the STEM subjects, were we not bringing in migrants as students and then continuing to employ them to keep those sort of areas continuing. There have to be some exceptions to it.
I definitely think there are exceptions, and very important exceptions. When we established our immigration white paper that I mentioned in January 2005, a very, very key element for the UK was an ability to assess what the skills shortages were and to understand what was happening in our economy and where we needed people in the ways that I'm describing. And so I think, yes, there will be exceptions, and yes, there should be exceptions. And, for example, in the case of universities today, I think it's completely ridiculous that students are inside the migration statistics, and they should be taken completely out of it, in my view, because the restraint on what is a vital national UK interest of expanding our universities internationally is far too sharp. So I completely agree with that. I suppose what I was saying, though, the other way, is at a time when you have very, very high levels of unemployment in many countries in the EU, to say we can solve our economic problems simply by people migrating in, and let's forget those people who are unemployed in Spain or whatever it might look to be, I think is a very poor way of proceeding. And I think we've got to think much harder about how we engage those people who are currently the socially excluded in countries throughout the EU. And I think sometimes migration becomes the easy answer. Certainly for many employers, migration is the easy answer. We'll just get the people in from somewhere else, rather than focusing on the problem we've got in our own country. And so, in answer to your question, I completely think there should be exceptions. There need to be proper skills audits and proper assessments of need. I 100% agree. But I also think we should be thinking all the time, and I acknowledge it's a long-term issue, how can we improve the capacity of people who live within the EU to do the work that needs to be done within the EU? And I think getting to a state of affairs where, 15% of the population of the EU is essentially not thought to be capable of doing key jobs within the EU is a pretty bad state of affairs for us. I mean, Felipe Gonzalez had his report in which he predicted there'd be a 50 million deficit of people by the year 2050. I think that was the figure they had. And for exactly the reason you say, the ageing population and so on. But I think all of those assumptions are based on a set of views about how the social model will continue. Will people always continue to retire at 65 or 60 or whatever it is, or not? And as we live longer, will people actually work longer? And I think there's a whole set of issues here which are much more complicated than some of the reports like his suggest.
Lord Sharkey, I think we must move on, yes.
You talked about partnerships. I mean, a core instrument of the general approach is the mobility partnership, which you characterise in your paper as modest in form. And so far there have been only 4 of them. Why do you think that is so? Why are there so few? Does it point to a fundamental defect in the nature of mobility partnerships?
Well, I fear that I think that it does. I'm in favour of mobility partnerships. They're positive things, they're a strong idea. But fundamentally, what you're talking about is the countries concerned doing a large amount of bureaucratic work for not much outcome at the end in terms of numbers of people. And if you're looking at the movements of people, you're really talking about quite small numbers. I don't know the details of the particular countries that you mentioned, but it must be a very small number of people in terms of the overall migratory issues that, for example, the UK or any of the other major EU countries are trying to address. And so you're putting a lot of effort into that basket for not much bang for the buck at the end in terms of having impact on your overall migration position. And that's why I think people think, well, is it really worth it? And this sounds terrible, but my experience is people think it's a good idea, we should do it, it's fine, it's all okay. But there's no real enthusiasm for it because people don't see it as really cracking the big issues that people feel they have to deal with in migration in their countries. Now, I don't wish to damn them by saying that, and I probably have damned them by saying that, but actually you've got to make for a much more substantive arrangement that really can work properly. If you're in Poland and you talk about Ukrainians coming to work, for example, in Poland for seasonal employment, that's an important part of their economy. It appears to work well. Nobody's got any complaints about it. Nobody's worried about the people coming through. I think that's probably true in Spain and some of the people coming from North Africa in the same kind of way. They're not really seen as mobility partnerships, and a mobility partnership is seen as something that makes those movements relatively bureaucratic rather than working in the way that migration normally does.
Yes, well, this committee, in fact, took the view on the issue of seasonal migration, that this was a subsidiarity issue and it was really much better left to individual countries to determine that one.
Well, as you'll see, Lord Hanley, in my pamphlet, I argue in the whole of the migration to work area, subsidiarity is the right way to go. Yes. Because, I mean, there may be some exceptions at the top IT levels or something, but fundamentally, I think the idea of an EU migration to work policy, a points-based system for the whole of the EU or something, is just pie in the sky. I think you just can't get there at the moment.
Thank you. Lord Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Morning, Mr. Clark.
Hello.
You mentioned earlier, I think, that clearly it is a political hot potato, immigration. I think we'd all agree with that. Given that, throughout Europe, I suppose, what scope do you think there is for more harmonisation of migration policies within the Union?
Firstly, I think it's important to realise, as I didn't before I started doing this pamphlet, that migration is not an equally hot political issue across the EU. It's a massive issue in Northern Europe here, Scandinavia, Benelux countries, and it's a big issue in Italy. If you, on the other hand, you go to Poland or Germany, much less preoccupation about it as an issue. And there's an interesting political question about the nature of the debate about migration in those countries and the extent to which the society has an overall shared approach. That said, I think there are a number of areas where we should be the EU should be increasing its work. Firstly, in the migration to reunite families, the rules about what are the rules according to which people can be reunited with their families. What is a spouse? What's the age of a spouse? What grandparents can come? How extended is the family? And so on. These are very different in different countries of the EU, and I think there really is a strong case for having a harmonised approach there at an EU level. Secondly, asylum policy. There's been an effort over many years to establish a common asylum policy for the EU, and I think that's a correct thing to do and would be an enhanced form of work, which the Commission I know is committed to already. Thirdly, returns and readmissions. I argue generally that this should be a much more significant part of EU foreign policy than it is. And the success of the European Commission in regard to returns agreements and readmissions agreements with other countries has been extremely patchy, to put it its most generous, and there are a large number of criticisms of the way in which even those agreements which do exist have in fact been operated. So I'd identify those three areas: migration, family reunification, common asylum policy, and returns and readmissions, as areas where a much more coherent EU approach would make a massive difference. I'd add to that then a set of other issues. I think, for example, developing the visa policy on a common basis, and I would argue for the UK to be part of that approach, would be a very important thing to do. And I'd also say, going back to Lord Judd's question, that the EU in all its dealings with its, particularly its neighbouring countries, but more widely, ought to be bringing the migration issue side by side with aid and trade and the other key foreign policy issues to be discussed when these issues are taken forward. So, in short, I think there are quite a number of issues where a much higher profile could be taken.
Thank you very much.
Well,
just picking up on,
Sorry.
just picking up on very quickly Lord Richard's point about you're saying the fact of migration isn't the problem, it's more to do with governance and so on, and numbers aren't important. But if there's pressure on hospitals, on housing, on all the social services that are provided, doesn't this fire the perception that it is about numbers? And this is fuelled, of course, generally by the tabloid press.
I'm very sceptical about this. As a constituency member of Parliament, I don't believe it's a fact that, for example, pressure on housing in a city like Norwich is very substantial as a result of migration. There is the issue of children and the issue of giving children priority, and that is an issue. Schools, well, my children went to a very multicultural primary school in Hackney in London, and that was a tremendous school, despite the fact of the large number of first languages that were spoken at the school. I don't think most of the people at the school thought it was a pressure in that way. To be quite honest, I think there's been a set of discussions about this which have been extremely ill-informed, for which government has to take some responsibility, and some pressure groups have built an argument which is not based in fact on this question of pressure on public services in this kind of way. Now, I may be accused of putting my head in the sand and saying this, but I don't believe the core problems that we have in our health service or our school system or whatever are a result of the pressure of migrants migrating to this country.
But would you agree there is a perception in some areas?
Of course. Yeah. And the perception has been established, and I think in a very negative way. For example, the argument was made by a former colleague of mine, John Denham, the MP for Southampton, that in Southampton the Polish plumbers had put massive pressure on the working situations there. All I'll say is I haven't seen that shared in other places. I don't think it's generally the case. And the much deeper issue is one I was referring to in answer to Lord Tomlinson, which is there are a significant group of people in this country who believe that they're entitled to work and see their inability to get work as being excluded as a result of people coming from abroad, that perception that you describe. Actually, I think in the case of many of those, we, the government, we, the society, have not been able to equip those people with the skills they need in the modern area, work habits and so on. And that's the core problem, not the migration itself.
Thank you.
Lord Avery.
Can I just go back to family reunification, which you said was a candidate for better European agreement? Do you think that in the light of recent restrictions on family reunification in this country, in the way of harsher requirements on use of the English language and financial hurdles that spouses and dependents have to overcome, that's really practicable? And should there be an intermediate stage where at least there's a clearinghouse within the European community for exchanging views on the rules that are adopted in individual member states on family reunification, so that you can begin to see what the spread is of different policies in individual states?
I certainly believe that there is a need for the kind of clearinghouse you describe, and that's one of the virtues of having a policy discussion about it, so people can understand what the policies actually are and what the meaning of those policies are in terms of numbers of people who are being admitted and so on. So I agree with you that that is a useful thing to do in its own terms. But I would also say that there's no particularly good reason why the definition of who is a spouse or who isn't, the age, common law, whatever, should vary across the EU. And the reason I think that you need to have a tighter position on it is because of this issue actually that Lord Mackenzie's been raising about the perception that people have. It goes back to what I was saying about governance. There is a sense that this is very loosely dealt with. Now, that may or may not be true. Actually, I think it's perhaps truer than it should be. But if you take, for example, the Geert Wilders party in Holland and look at their programme, which went into the coalition agreement with the Conservatives in Holland, which is absolutely full in that context of the family reunification issues for migrants to Holland in that position. I just think it's an important area to get a clarity about what the rule is, and so that people understand exactly what it is. My perceptions are not about, I understand what you're saying about the financial requirement that's there and so on. My point is not about that. My point is about defining who is the family, who is entitled to come.
There is pressure.
Can I come back to the question of integrating migration along with police security aid into the foreign policy? Because you've touched that twice. My question really is, do you think it's realistic? And if it is, how can it be done? Because I agree with you, but on the other hand, in my mind, there's a question mark that if it's realistic, is it possible?
I think it is realistic. The key issue of illegal migration is the people traffickers, is illegal, very, very wealthy syndicates with tremendous power. And the question is, how do you break them? And you can only break them through proper police cooperation with governments in those areas. There has been some success. Frontex has had some success, for example, on the Greece-Turkey border in attacking the criminal syndicates there, and have been able to make a number of different arrests. But what is required is cooperation and intelligence. Now, can you get cooperation? And you asked me whether that's an overambitious hope. I think you can get cooperation, provided we are ready to provide resources to help make that go. Resources, by the way, which are very well spent, because at the end of the day, if we succeed in keeping out the people trafficking organisations, the criminality, that saves us a great deal of resource in our own terms. Can you share intelligence in these situations? More difficult, because sharing intelligence is entirely a question of trust and whether people are ready to trust others. And if you take, for example, the Western Balkans, there are a lot of issues of trust around as to whether you can in fact trust the police and security forces in some of those countries, or have they already been infiltrated and taken over by the organisations I'm describing. So it's a hard process, and you can't just click your fingers and do it, but I think by a serious strategic approach you can make a good deal of progress. If you look at the latest Europol strategic threat assessment of crime, they identify 5 centres across the EU, which are the big 5 areas where they think people trafficking is coming through in very large quantities. And what you need is the police in those areas to work together to attack that and to give no space to the criminal organisations. Can that be achieved? Well, I think it can. I think there is a big question of resources. The example I remember very well was Operation Reflex, which I remember visiting their operations in Bulgaria and Romania. And it was a tremendous operation which was succeeding in stopping whole lorry loads of people being shipped from beyond Turkey, ending up in Northampton, by a police intelligence-led operation which was working extremely well. But that money was only able to fund it in Bulgaria and Romania at that time because they weren't yet in the EU. Within the EU, doing it in Greece, there were no funds available to do it, and you couldn't make it happen. So I think the EU as a whole should also be raising its overall level of resources into these issues. It's a trivial amount that the EU spends on all of this compared with the needs, and compared, it's a common complaint of course, compared with the common agricultural policy or whatever, it's much more central to the actual capacity of the EU, this, than any other area. So I think firstly, national governments, national police, national security have to collaborate. Secondly, nationally we have to allocate more resources. And thirdly, the EU has to allocate more resources. The problem is it works in reverse. When you're at a time of spending cuts as we are at the moment, and Lord Mackenzie could probably say this more articulately than I could, but what police services tend to do is to retrench themselves to their domestic and see what's being done internationally as a bit marginal. And I think that's a wrong view, but I think that's what's happening. And so, I don't think it's whistling in the wind. Police themselves at senior levels do understand the need for international cooperation and are ready to work to make that happen.
But that requires a massive sort of change in mindset, cultural change and so on. I mean, what levers would you use to bring that about?
Well, one of the levers is resources itself. So the EU to provide resources for particular programmes. The problem about that is that sometimes it just is the extra resources rather than allocating the existing resources there. But I think it's simply a question of telling the story about crime. The story about crime is the biggest threats on criminality in this country are drugs, people trafficking, serious and organised crime in that way, and then counter-terrorism. It used to be the case, I don't know if it still is, that 80% of the heroin arriving in Britain was travelling up through Kosovo. And if we could stop it there, we could then stop it reaching us. But we didn't. We didn't work in that way to do it. And I think you've just got to make this argument. Now, I mean, I don't want to trespass on what Lord Hannay said right at the beginning, but it's one of the reasons why I strongly believe the UK should stay a key part of all the EU protocols and arrangements to promote police cooperation.
I mean, you've talked predominantly about police and security cooperation, but what about trade and aid?
Well, again, I think the same. I think one of the problems is the EU is quite an unwieldy group. We had in the Home Affairs area something called the G6, which was the 6 biggest countries, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, UK, and when I was Home Secretary, Poland was added to turn it from a G5 to a G6. And we had exceptionally interesting meetings to discuss precisely how to do this, including on trade and aid, though we were Home Secretaries. But at a level where you were small enough to be able to discuss it in quite a material way. But the big EU Council meetings, it was are very formalistic type of gatherings, quite difficult to get, even in the informal sessions, a really sharp conversation going. I can see Lord Richard going to sleep immediately just thinking about those meetings he attended as a commissioner. The fact is that you can have that conversation, but it's got to be very targeted, and it has to include trade and aid.
To be fair to your former department, when we took evidence on the EU's drug strategy, which was our last inquiry, in which we published a report, the Home Office and SOCA were absolutely clear that the reduction in resources available nationally made them more interested in what was being done by Europol than before, because they relied on it to a greater extent than they had done when resources had been a bit more plentiful, national resources a bit more plentiful.
I'm very encouraged.
And I was very struck by that evidence. If that is indeed the view of the government and ministers, I think it's a healthy view, and it chimes exactly with what you were saying.
Well, I'm sorry I missed that evidence. I hadn't noticed it, but I'm very encouraged by what you say. I suppose I was going further back in time, and the sense that this was all seen as a bit marginal was a problem.
I think there's something that's known in the jargon as cultural change may have taken place. Let's hope so.
Well, I shall take responsibility for that positive
Lord
cultural change.
Can we turn to the common European asylum system? And could you say how you think disagreements between northern and southern member states over the so-called burden sharing can be reconciled or overcome?
I think the only way to deal with the burden sharing argument is for the EU as a whole, the wealthier north, to provide more resources to the south to help them in their management of their external border and of their asylum. I don't think that the proposition that the Dublin process should be reversed or something is right. I don't believe there should be some kind of allocation of people who come into Sicily then be transported up to Sweden or something. I don't think that's the way to deal with the burden sharing. The way to deal with the burden sharing is to say we, all the EU, including those outside Schengen, UK and Ireland, recognise that this is a much bigger problem, the land and sea border in the south than it is in the north, and that we are ready to provide resources and help. If you take the Greek situation, for example, I think I'm right in saying that the Greek provision of asylum accommodation was found to violate the European Convention of Human Rights, and so people couldn't be moved to Greece in those circumstances. Now, the obvious solution is for countries such as ours to give resources to Greece, either through the EU or directly, to help them solve and overcome the problem. So my fundamental answer on burden sharing is not to say shift the migrants to somewhere else in the EU, but shift the resources to those places where the pressure is greatest, which is mainly the south.
Does that mean that Europol will be given responsibilities for helping the Greeks police their borders, or how?
Well, Frontex, does do that and does coordinate it already, and in fact UK police and others, and I think military as well, have been part of some of the Frontex operations in southern Europe, and others are as well, but that's only just a slowly growing process. I think it has to happen much faster. On the specific asylum, ESO, the European Asylum Support Office, sorry, I may have got the acronym slightly wrong, is ready to work in that area, and I think there's a case for it doing so.
Can I ask then, I know you've argued that the Commission will have to show more willingness to take Member States to the European Court of Justice if they fail to implement common asylum rules. Can you see any prospect that this will happen?
I thought no. A year ago, 2 years ago, I said no. But I think Commissioner Cecilia Malmström is, I think she's an excellent commissioner. I think she's done a very good job in this area. And by her statements in this area, she's trying to move it up the agenda the whole time. I can imagine a situation in the next 2 or 3 years where states would really work much harder to enforce the agreements that are there. The problem about most of these agreements in the past is they've been not quite dead letters, that's an exaggeration, but not necessarily enforced as rigorously as they need to. And I'm arguing there needs to be rigour in these areas, and that's why I think the case for people taking people to the European Court of Justice is there. I would say it's not likely right now. It's more likely now than it was a couple of years ago, and in 3 or 4 years it will be more likely still.
Lord Tomlinson.
Earlier on you touched on e-borders and the problems and the imperatives of the system of securing external borders. But do you believe that the EU can secure its external border while at the same time respecting the human rights of migrants? And here I'm thinking particularly where you get mixed flows of both asylum seekers and economic migrants, and very difficult for the authorities to determine which is which.
I think you can. I mean, let's remember, as far as the external border is concerned, that a year or so ago, I think I'm right in saying more than 90% of the people coming illegally through the EU external border, the Schengen, I should say, external border, were coming through by the Ebro River between Greece and Turkey, more than 90%. And the big flows that there had been from West Africa to Spain and from North Africa to Italy and Malta were reduced to a very small flow as a result of agreements and partnership between the countries concerned. The Arab Spring put a bit more pressure on that, and there's still some issues right at the moment of issues which are in there. But I think it is possible to deal with it. On the human rights aspect of it, I think the core issue that is the human right is the right of an asylum seeker to have their case for asylum judged quickly and effectively and taking full account of the circumstances of both themselves and their country. And the biggest failure of most of the governments in this area, including our own for a long period of time, was that we didn't make that judgment either accurately or quickly over a long period of time. For example, in the UK, there were too many judgments being made by the Home Office and by the Borders Agency, which were being overthrown by the courts because they hadn't been properly considered in the right way. So the right, which I would say is the central right for the asylum seeker, is to have their case dealt with properly. And that's largely about having a good bureaucratic system that does, as you say, take the different cases of the mixed flows of people and assess their individual circumstances in that way. It is massively difficult for governments to do that properly, but there's no way around that. You simply have to do it. I think the more shocking abuse of human rights is the death of many asylum seekers at sea or in whatever circumstances. We had a terrible case when I was junior minister of 50 Chinese people being trafficked and dying in a container crossing the channel. Appalling situation. I went to see the container shortly afterwards. It was a shocking thing. And those rights where people are losing their lives as a result of incorrectly policed border, I think is a much more serious abuse than some of the abuses that others are concerned about.
In terms of the proper bureaucratic system for determining asylum cases, would you hypothesise a time limit that should be placed on that?
I wouldn't put a time limit in at this stage, but you're right to do so. I think it's reasonable for there to be a time limit during which people's cases are heard. The real problem is that the systems of many of the countries aren't capable of dealing with that, and therefore a time limit would be completely arbitrary. But actually, I think a goal of policy ought to be, and it's one of the cases for a European common asylum policy, ought to be that cases of applications for asylum are heard in a defined period and properly heard. I think being properly heard is very important, i.e. that the genuine issues of the asylum seeker are understood by the agency in a proper way, which is a highly skilled and technical job, obviously. But I think there's no good in putting in an arbitrary time limit. I think there's a case for what in the jargon might be called a key performance indicator, where people are, where you're trying to move towards a situation, doing it on a certain timescale. But, and I come back to the point, it requires investment. And going back to Lord Avebury's question about burden sharing, I think that's exactly the kind of area where you could really look at the northern countries doing more to help the southern countries where the pressures are the greatest.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a new case when Croatia enters the European Union, because the European Union will then acquire an extremely long border with Bosnia-Herzegovina as a result of that, 800 kilometres, which will be very difficult for the Croatians to handle. That is very much, I think, what you're talking about the sensible thing to do is for the northern and western member states, as it were, to provide some resource to help these countries to handle it, rather than to try and have a system for spreading the asylum seekers around.
Well, two things. I had an interesting conversation with the head of the region office of the Institute of Migration in Brussels a couple of months ago, who'd just been to Greece to see the situation. I think the IOM, if properly resourced, would be ready to help in Greece to ensure that they could operate more effectively. I think that you could find other non-governmental organisations ready to help make that go. Secondly, of course, the Croatia example is the reason why I argue that we should move as rapidly as we can to all of the Western Balkans acceding to the European Union, because I think our border would be far more defensible. And I applaud the process which happened of the visa negotiation between Schengen and most of the West Balkan states, which led to West Balkan visas being accepted within Schengen, because the other side was a massive reform that those countries had to go through. Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, had to go through in order to be able to do that. They had to reform their systems, establish them in a proper way, and all the rest of it. And that was a massive process for them. The UK, of course, is stayed completely outside that approach, and we haven't been prepared to do what Schengen's done in relation to visas from the Western Balkans. But I think the best way to defend the Croatian border would be for the other West Balkan states in that region to have good systems themselves and to operate effectively. And we should be doing what we can to help that. And I'd say accelerating their membership process to the EU would be a good way of doing it.
Right, Lord Judd.
You argued that the European Court of Human Rights and the UN Refugee Convention were created and designed for different times, that times have changed and that the form these take perhaps needs to be re-examined. Could you spell out a bit what you mean by this?
Well, I have to confess I find it very difficult. I observe that things have changed greatly since the late 40s, early 50s when these agreements were made. And I see lots of discussions about what is the entitlement for asylum. Should, for example, a homosexual from Belarus be entitled to asylum in the UK? Is that something that would have been envisaged in the past? Or is it something that's become now envisaged because of the standards that we now have as to what is oppressive and what exists in these circumstances? And I think it is worth having a debate about it. Now, if you ask me what specifics I would say, I find that quite difficult to answer. I simply think there should be a tighter definition of the things against which asylum is needed, if I can put it like that. And I think a virtue of getting to that position is that people in this country would accept it more than they currently do. Now, obviously, conflict and war are things from which asylum is entirely justified. Obviously, torture and oppression are things from which asylum is entirely justified. But I think it is, as you define slightly more widely, the basis upon which you can get asylum, I think it weakens the process. So I would have a widespread discussion about it, but I'd have to confess, Lord Judd, if you ask me to, I haven't got in my back pocket, as it were, a draft new charter. But going back to Baroness Pusher's point about my optimism about this, I think the chance of this happening is zero, because the chance of getting international agreement of change in this area is almost irrelevant. I was glad the British government in its chairmanship of the Council of Europe raised some issues and got some reform at the meeting in Brighton earlier this year. but I think it was a pretty marginal change that they got, and mainly about the process rather than about the forms and definitions. So I put this in as a point for discussion, as it were, rather than as a charter for action. Because
but some of your observations seem to show a good deal more exasperation than you've just expressed. And I mean, you've used terms like the silliness of some of the messages coming from European institutions, and you've talked about the questions around the way in which the 1996 Shahal judgment was used.
Yeah.
Now, how far, since you come away from the heat of office, do you feel that this may be, historically, a matter of a very rather fundamental challenge in terms of what are human rights and what political pressures to do really are?
I think this is a massively difficult area. Obviously the Shahal judgment was in the context of terrorism, and we had the issue with a number of contemporary people of whether they could be deported back to particularly North African countries or not. I wasn't really trying to cover that in this area, because these are questions, the ones we're just talking about now, are about terrorists rather than the more general issues that arise. But I negotiated the Memorandum of Understanding, which were controversial, with a number of North African countries. And the reason I went down that course was I was very influenced by a discussion at the Cabinet, where a number of my colleagues in the Cabinet thought we had to pull out of the ECHR. And the then leader of the opposition, Michael Howard, argued that we should be pulling out of the ECHR. I was completely against pulling out of the ECHR because I think it's an absolutely fundamental bulwark of our freedoms. But I felt we needed to find a way of addressing the problems that were there, and that's why I went round the process of trying to get Memorandum of Understanding, which, with the exception of Libya, are in place now today. And I think that's what you have to do. But at the moment, it's ridiculous that the ECHR becomes a term of abuse almost in politics. It's a very dangerous thing, and a really profoundly dangerous thing. And so we've got to try and find some mechanism of defining it and explaining it better than is currently the place. The current court itself, the European Court, is not that impressive a body at a variety of different levels. I was at a private academic seminar in the last year with a number of members of the Supreme Court and senior politicians, and a number of the people there, much more legally qualified than I, think it's inevitable that we will leave the ECHR because the tensions are so great. Now, what I was doing in putting my point in, which you've asked the question about, is to say this is something we've got to try and get hold of and talk about seriously. And because these things seem to be frozen in aspic, we can't talk about them, but the danger is we end up moving out of it altogether.
But you would say that in that examination, it would be necessary to repeatedly point out in capital letters that this is about making them more effective, and it's not about reducing the moral, ethical
Absolutely not.
demands of justice.
And the answer to your question is yes, we have to absolutely maintain the principles, its core, but then we have to discuss more to what extent are we saying that certain things mean that you can genuinely seek asylum from another country.
And that is not part of a kind of xenophobic approach, that we don't like bloody foreigners telling us.
No, I think the reverse is true. I think the xenophobic approach says we've reached a utopian society in Britain, which we all have worked for over all these years, and those North Africans or those whoever can never get to our utopian society, therefore you can never get a fair trial there or whatever. The most terrible case when I was Home Secretary was with France, where there was we couldn't extradite somebody to France who was alleged to have committed a terrorist attack because the courts here said you can't get a fair trial in France, and they required the French government to come and give evidence about how their system worked. And I talked to Sarkozy about it. He was the Interior Minister at the time. And he said, we're not going to go I said, you've got to come over, you've got to send somebody to the court to say you do get fair trials in France. He said, we can't do that. The pride of France is at stake. The idea of us going to a foreign court saying this, and I understood his position, by the way, but finally he agreed. And then they did it, and then the guy was extradited and tried properly in France. But it was because our system believes that only in Britain does it work and do you have a fair system. All the other systems don't work. Sorry, I'm on my high horse about it. I'll get off
If
the
I
board.
remember rightly, that case is a case which could not now occur because of the European arrest warrant.
It wasn't just the arrest question. You're right, but it wasn't just the arrest question. I think the arrest warrant probably would have solved it. But it was also, this was particularly an extradition case, and I think if that person had been arrested with a European arrest warrant at the outset, that would have been, you're right, that case couldn't have arisen.
Yeah. Lord Bridgman.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Mr. Clark, I think it's appropriate, this is the last question. Do you believe that the UK can continue to contribute constructively and effectively to the EU's migration policy when it has not opted into many of the legislative measures undermining that policy? And do you believe that the UK should at some stage become a full member of the Schengen area? You mentioned Greece has got a fairly bad press in your pamphlet. Do you think that that situation should affect the timing of our entry, where you've got one clearly weak link in comparison with the generality of the rest of the Schengen area?
2 points really, Lord Bridgman. First, I think it's distasteful, in a sense, for us to go on about how the rest of Europe should govern itself if we're not prepared to participate fully in the process. I argue that in the economic area, but that's not for this committee. But I also argue it here. And we try and get the benefits of the cooperation without being ready to kind of fully put in, if I can put it like that. And so I do believe that we should be opting in to the range of justice and home affairs measures, I think 130 of them or something like that, fully, and being full participants as much as we can. And I think we'd be much stronger if we did so and more secure. I've gradually evolved my position on Schengen. I used to hold the view on Schengen that we ought to join Schengen when two conditions were met. Condition one, there was a genuinely strong and secure external EU border. And condition two was that we had ID cards established in this country, which I thought would be a help in controlling the situation. Condition two I've dropped because the government has dropped it for me. Condition one remains, and it's exactly your point about Greece, that if we aren't confident about the security of the external border of the EU, then we shouldn't join Schengen. But once we become confident of the strength of the external border of the EU, then I think we should join Schengen, and there'd be a large number of benefits to our security which would arise if we did so. I think the most profound weakness of the EU external border at the moment is the Greece-Turkey border, not any of the other borders. There are always issues in the other borders. And so I suppose feeling confident that that had been properly resolved would fill that condition. But my fundamental view is that we should join Schengen and seek the conditions to make that happen.
Can I just ask a supplementary? It was Greece-Turkey border I was talking about. I think you refer to the possibility of, as it were, a trade-off, a carrot, that Turkey should have a rather easier visa entry into the EU, and therefore have influences in Turkey. Is that a step in the right direction?
I think it is. I mean, the trade-off on all the visa issues, is we will allow visas provided the country from which the people are coming has got proper systems themselves and proper records and systems that operate. That was the trade-off that was done for the Western Balkan states, and I think that's massively improved the administration of these issues in those countries. With Turkey, I think there's a great desire on the Turkish part to be able to work in that way. We have a desire, for example, on readmissions agreements and things like that, to be able to have a much better relationship. And I think if you had a full negotiation around all of these issues, you could get a package which was beneficial to the UK. Unfortunately, in the case of Turkey, there's firstly a problem with Greece, and both Greece and Cyprus make it very difficult to deal with Turkey in an effective way on this matter for the whole EU. But then for the UK, for Turkey itself, their sense that the EU's messing them about, I think, is making it very difficult to engage them in the way that's necessary in these ways. I think that's become worse over the last 3 or 4 years. And in a way, I don't blame the Turks for this. I think they're trying to establish their own position, develop their own economy. And we, the EU, are not making it easy.
Well, I think there is some hope that the readmission agreement with Turkey will now go through.
Yes, there is. Yes.
That was some very good work was put in by the Danish presidency just before the end of June, and I think the processes are now turning for that, which would be a step forward.
Yes.
I would only add in relation to your two conditions you had for joining Schengen, that of course the coalition government, has now introduced a third, which is a requirement for a referendum.
Well, I'm against the Europe. I can't remember what it's called, the Europe Act of 2011 or whatever it was. I thought that was an appalling piece of legislation and very damaging in many ways. But the whole discussion of referenda on EU matters is one. I don't know if you're going to have a special evidence session on it, but I'd be more than happy to contribute at some point if you do.
Absolutely. Could we now just, as a kind of tailpiece, move to Protocol 36? Thank you very much, by the way, for all the answers you've given on the other questions, which will help us a great deal in our inquiry. But Protocol 36 is, of course, looming in the sense that it's ticking away. By May 2014, the British government has to declare whether or not it will accept the European Court of Justice's jurisdiction on all those pieces of legislation which were adopted before the Lisbon Treaty came into force. That's the 133, which I think you referred to in one of your earlier answers. It doesn't, of course, affect legislation that has been introduced since the Lisbon Treaty came into force, where if we opt in, we are ipso facto accepting the European Court of Justice's jurisdiction as from, I think it is, November 2014. But it's those 133 pre-Lisbon instruments, legal instruments, which are covered by Protocol 36, and which we will be writing a report to help the House of Lords, at least, take the decision that the government has decided to put sometime between now and May 2014. So, having sort of set the scene a little bit, it would be helpful if you could say the thoughts you had on this subject.
I suppose my thoughts come into two or three categories. The first is that I regret that the opt-out was agreed by the British government, and it was the Labour government at the time, in these areas. I don't think the so-called red line of this was a necessary thing, either in public opinion terms or in an overall political situation. But it reflected the opinion of many of my colleagues in government that we ought to do that, but I personally regret it. Secondly, it having been done, I hope that this government will decide that it does not want to opt out of any of these measures and simply agrees to the authority of the European Court of Justice. Why do I believe that? I believe that it partly relates to the answers I gave earlier to Baroness Pruchard. I believe that the cooperation with other European police and security agencies and with other governments in these areas is an absolutely central part of our capacity to police and make secure our country, UK national interest, our country, against the various threats that come from international criminality. And I think to weaken that capacity is a very serious and problematic issue. I think to opt out of these requirements would really explicitly weaken that capacity. Some say we could opt out and then re-up back in. As Open Europe, not a particularly pro-European think tank, says in the House of Commons note on this, you can't assume that the others would immediately allow us to opt back in areas that we wanted to opt back in immediately. Probably they would, because they'd see an interest in the whole situation, but they wouldn't necessarily do so, and we'd be engendering a massive process of uncertainty and turmoil at precisely the wrong time. So I absolutely hope strongly that they will decide not to take that course of action. Unfortunately, and I'll make a political point here, I think there are parts of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons who are the tail that is wagging the dog on these questions, up to and including the Prime Minister. And so the question of where the national interest is in this matter is chucked out of the window by comparison with what is the real national interest in proper security and policing. I in fact wish that, as I've answered on Schengen earlier, that we would engage much more in these areas. And I think that the approach that's been suggested will be very damaging.
Well, thank you for that evidence, which we will put on one side and will become available to us when we do our next report, which is going to be on that particular subject. And if when we issue the call for evidence, you felt able to give us some written evidence on the particular individual issues where you think the national interest is directly involved among the 133, some of which, of course, may have been overtaken by then because there may be subsequent post-Lisbon instruments. For example, on Europol, we believe the Commission is going to make proposals which will include post-Lisbonizing, if we can use that terrible phrase, Europol, but also introducing a cybercrime centre, which this committee and the British government strongly support in Europol. And that is one example of something that might disappear from the list. But if when we issue our call for evidence at the end of this year you felt able to contribute on the detail and to identify the bits of national interest which you believe would be put at risk if we opted out, that would be very welcome. And you are, of course, quite right in saying that the British government cannot assume that if it opts out, it will automatically be able to opt back into the bits that it likes. That would require unanimity and would contain certain risks. Must be, I think, the only time in recorded history when any government would have willingly given itself a worse negotiating hand than it had at the beginning. But there we are.
I certainly will take up your offer at the time. Thank you very much, Lord Hannock. Perhaps I could just make two remarks the further. Firstly is the Irish situation should be thought about very carefully. I presented this pamphlet to a seminar in Ireland and we had this discussion, and they really, and this is big leadership in Ireland in the police and security field, I think they absolutely do not want to opt out of these various agreements, but feel because of our common arrangement with the UK and Ireland, they'd find themselves in a very, very difficult situation. And I just think it's very important to see what Ireland would do, because it would be in a very difficult situation at this moment, and it would damage our relationship with them, which I think would be also very serious for us. And the only other point I was going to make is that you have much more experience than I have in this. Lord Richard has much more experience than I, but for the first time in the last year, I've begun to feel that across the rest of the European Union, where previously all the leaderships have wanted the UK involved and been hoping we'd sort it out, etc., 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 suddenly, and quite sharply, I felt this very much in Berlin earlier this year, they think, we can't be bothered. And it's a change which I think is really tangible. So when the question of the opt-in comes back after we've opted out in this hypothesis, I just think a lot of people in the big European Union countries say, we can't be bothered with this. If they're out, they're out. Just let them get on with it. And I would have said, any time in the last 30 years...
I think we may have to consider that to be outside the scope of our inquiry. probably in the interest